The morning of May 5th, 1945, 13 miles northeast of Bly, Oregon. Reverend Archie Mitchell steered his sedan up a one-lane gravel road cutting through ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. Beside him sat his wife Elsie, 5 months pregnant, feeling carsick from the winding climb up Gearhart Mountain. In the back, 5 children from their Sunday school class chattered with the anticipation of a Saturday picnic, fishing rods clattering against the windows. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The war in Europe had ended just 2 days before. Japan's surrender seemed inevitable. For a moment, in this remote corner of the American West, peace felt tangible. Elsie and the children stepped out first, grateful for fresh air and solid ground. They walked ahead toward Leonard Creek, while Archie parked the car and gathered the lunch baskets. The forest floor was scattered with last winter's pine needles, soft and fragrant underfoot. Joan Patzke, 13 years old, spotted something white among the trees. She called to the others. Sherman Shoemaker, 11, jogged over. So did Dick Patzke, Joan's 14-year-old brother, along with Gifford and Edward Engen, both 13. Elsie Mitchell walked toward them, curious about their find. "Look what we found, dear," she called back to her husband. Archie Mitchell glanced up from the car. 50 yards away, his wife and the 5 children stood in a tight circle around something on the ground. He had heard rumors, vague whispers about strange balloons found in the woods. His mind raced to connect the fragments of information he had absorbed in recent weeks. "Don't touch it!" he began to shout. The explosion cut him off. A sharp crack echoed through the trees, then a deeper boom that rolled across the mountainside. Fire flashed. Metal fragments whistled through the pines, tearing bark, snapping branches. Archie Mitchell ran toward the smoke. His hands would be burned, trying to extinguish the flames consuming his wife's dress. But it was too late. Elsie Mitchell died in his arms. Around her lay the bodies of 5 children, killed instantly by a 33-pound anti-personnel bomb that had travelled 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean, carried by nothing more than wind and paper. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They were the only American civilians killed by direct enemy action on the continental United States during World War II. But their deaths were not the result of a bomber raid, submarine attack, or commando operation. They died because of something far stranger, a weapon so improbable that most Americans had never heard of it, and would not learn about it until after the war ended. They died because Japan had weaponized the wind itself. Between November 3rd, 1944, and April 20th, 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army launched approximately 9,300 hydrogen-filled paper balloons from coastal sites on Honshu, each carrying a payload of bombs designed to float across the Pacific and rain fire on American forests. The Japanese called them fugo, wind ship weapons. The Americans who found them simply called them balloon bombs. And for 6 months, the United States government kept their existence almost entirely secret from the American people, a decision that may have directly contributed to the deaths in Oregon. This is the verified story of Operation Fugo, the first intercontinental weapons system in human history, and the strange collision of desperation, ingenuity, silence, and tragedy that defined its brief and terrible existence. To understand how Japan came to launch thousands of paper balloons across an ocean, you must first understand the context of 1944. By autumn of that year, the Pacific War had turned decisively against Japan. American forces had recaptured Guam, invaded the Philippines, and most significantly, begun regular bombing raids on the Japanese home islands using the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress. These raids, launched from bases in China and later the Mariana Islands, represented something unprecedented in Japanese experience. For the first time since the 13th century Mongol invasions, foreign forces were striking Japanese territory with impunity. The B-29 was a technological marvel that Japan could not match. It flew at altitudes Japanese fighters struggled to reach, carried enormous bomb loads, and had the range to strike Tokyo itself. Japanese leaders watched their cities burn and understood with stark clarity that they possessed no equivalent weapon to retaliate against the American mainland. Their submarine fleet, which had briefly threatened the West Coast in 1942, had been decimated. Their aircraft carriers, the pride of the combined fleet, lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Their long-range bomber program had never produced anything approaching the B-29's capabilities. But there was one resource Japan still possessed in abundance: wind. Specifically, the powerful high-altitude air currents that flowed from west to east across the Pacific Ocean, today known as the jet stream. In 1944, these winds were poorly understood by Western meteorologists, but Japanese researchers had been studying them for years. And, in Japan's desperation, those winds offered a solution. The concept of balloon weapons was not entirely new to the Imperial Japanese Army. As early as 1933, Lieutenant General Reikichi Tada's 9th Technical Research Institute, also known as the Noborito Research Institute, had experimented with balloon bombs. These early designs were crude, small 13-foot balloons with limited range, intended for short-distance attacks. But they established the basic concept that balloons could deliver explosives over territory, inaccessible by conventional means. The idea was revived after April 18, 1942, when 16 American B-25 bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagoya. The Doolittle raid did minimal physical damage, but the psychological impact was profound. Japan's military leadership, which had assured the emperor that the home islands were invulnerable, had been humiliated. Retaliation became a matter of national honor. The Noborito Research Institute received orders to find a way to strike back at America. Initial proposals focused on submarine-launched balloons, small weapons that could be released 600 miles off the American coast. 2 submarines, I-34 and I-35, were prepared for such missions. 200 balloons were produced by August 1943, but the plan was postponed when every available submarine was recalled for the Guadalcanal campaign. The idea might have died there, except that Japanese meteorologists made a crucial discovery. In the winter of 1943 and 1944, researchers working with the Noborito Institute tested the winter jet stream. Using high-altitude weather balloons equipped with basic radio transmitters, they tracked these air currents across the Pacific. What they found was remarkable. In November through March, when the jet stream reached peak velocity, winds at altitudes between 25,000 and 35,000 feet could achieve speeds of 100 to 200 miles per hour. A balloon launched into these currents could, in theory, reach North America in 60 to 70 hours, roughly 3 days. This discovery transformed the balloon weapon from a submarine-based tactical device into a strategic intercontinental system. By March 1943, Major General Tsuyoshi Kusaba, the officer placed in charge of the Fugo project, had developed a workable design. The balloons would be large, 33 feet in diameter when inflated, capable of carrying 35 pounds of explosives to an altitude where the jet stream could carry them across 5,000 miles of ocean. But creating such a weapon presented extraordinary engineering challenges. The first problem was materials. Japan in 1944 was a nation under siege. The Allied naval blockade had strangled imports of rubber, oil, and countless other critical resources. Traditional balloon materials, rubberized silk or cloth, were simply unavailable in the quantities needed to produce thousands of balloons. The solution came from Japanese tradition. The balloons would be constructed from washi, a paper made from the bark of the kozo bush, also known as the paper mulberry tree. This paper, when properly prepared, possessed remarkable properties. Thin, lightweight, yet extraordinarily strong and durable, it could hold hydrogen gas better than many fabrics. But creating a hydrogen envelope 33 feet in diameter required more than paper. It required precision engineering in an age before modern adhesives. The solution was konnyaku paste, made from the konjac potato. This natural glue, traditionally used in Japanese papermaking, would bond 4 to 5 layers of washi together, creating a laminated structure strong enough to survive the trans-Pacific journey. The actual construction of these balloons required thousands of workers. In August 1944, under the Women's Volunteer Labor Order, the Japanese military mobilized teenage girls from high schools across the country. Unmarried females, aged 12 and up, received orders to report to large indoor spaces across Tokyo. These included the Nichigeki Music Hall, the Ryogoku Kokugikan Sumo Hall, the Takarazuka Theatre, and several aircraft hangars. When the girls arrived, military police delivered a stark warning. The work they were about to perform was a top military secret. They were forbidden, under penalty of severe consequences, from speaking about it to anyone, including family members. The girls were not told what they were making. They worked in near darkness to maintain secrecy, their tasks seemingly abstract and disconnected from any larger purpose. Teams of girls cut panels of washi paper according to precise templates. Other teams applied konnyaku paste with brushes, working quickly before it dried. Still others layered the paper panels, pressing them together to form the laminated sheets. The work was meticulous, demanding, and physically exhausting. Many girls labored 12 to 14 hours per day in poorly ventilated spaces, given minimal food and no time off. They worked in silence, forbidden from asking questions or discussing their tasks. Each balloon required approximately 600 individual paper panels, all precisely cut and glued together in a specific pattern to create a spherical envelope. The seams had to be perfect. A single weak point could cause catastrophic failure at high altitude. The finished envelope, when deflated, looked like an enormous, crumpled white shroud. When inflated with hydrogen, it expanded into a massive sphere 33 feet across, taller than a 3-story building. But the balloon itself was only part of the weapon system. The true ingenuity of the Fugo design lay in its automatic altitude control mechanism, a system that, in an era before computers or microchips, used purely mechanical means to regulate the balloon's flight across thousands of miles of ocean. The payload, called a chandelier because of its appearance, hung beneath the balloon on a network of shroud lines. At the center was the bomb load, 4 11-pound incendiary devices designed to start forest fires, and one 33-pound anti-personnel bomb filled with picric acid explosive. Surrounding these bombs was a ring of small sandbags, each weighing approximately 5 pounds. There were 32 sandbags in total, providing about 160 pounds of ballast. The control mechanism operated through a series of barometric switches connected to an electric battery. As the balloon rose and atmospheric pressure decreased, one set of switches would activate, releasing hydrogen through blow plugs to prevent the balloon from climbing too high and bursting. As the balloon descended and pressure increased, different switches would activate, dropping sandbags to make the balloon lighter and cause it to rise again. This cycle of expansion and contraction would repeat throughout the 3-day journey across the Pacific. The system was designed with a specific flight profile in mind. The balloons would be launched in late afternoon or evening, when the jet stream typically descended to lower altitudes over coastal Japan. They would climb to between 25,000 and 35,000 feet, catch the jet stream, and begin their eastward journey. During the day, solar heating would cause the hydrogen to expand, and the balloon would rise. At night, cooling would cause contraction, and the balloon would descend. Each cycle would trigger the automatic release of ballast or gas, keeping the balloon within the optimal altitude range. The designers calculated that 32 ballast drops would sustain the balloon for approximately 60 to 70 hours of flight, sufficient time to cross the Pacific. After the final ballast bag dropped, one more altitude descent would trigger the bomb release mechanism. The bombs would detach from the chandelier. A fuse would ignite a block of picric acid attached to the chandelier itself. This explosion would destroy the control mechanism and ignite the remaining hydrogen, vaporizing the balloon and eliminating most evidence of its origin. It was an elegant system, remarkably sophisticated for its time. It was also, by necessity, completely unguided. Once launched, the balloons were at the mercy of the wind. There was no way to control where they would land, no way to target specific cities or military installations. The Japanese strategy relied on statistical probability. If enough balloons were launched, some would inevitably reach North America, and even if they caused minimal physical damage, The psychological impact of bombs falling randomly from the sky might force the Americans to divert resources, troops, and attention from the Pacific Theater to homeland defense. Production targets were ambitious. The Army initially ordered 10,000 balloons for the winter winds of 1944 and 1945. 3 industrial firms received contracts: the Mitsubishi Saishi Paper Factory, the Nippon Kakokin Company, and the Kokuka Rubber Company coordinated production with military specifications. By autumn 1944, balloons were being completed at a rate of dozens per day. Storage facilities filled with the massive white envelopes, waiting for the November jet stream. The launch sites were chosen with care. 3 coastal locations on Honshu provided optimal access to the jet stream: Nakoso, Otsu, and Ichinomiya Beach. These sites offered relatively flat terrain for inflation and launch, proximity to hydrogen production facilities, and, importantly, locations away from major population centers where security could be maintained. Each launch required substantial manpower and careful timing. Preparing a single balloon for flight took between 30 minutes and 1 hour and required approximately 30 men. The deflated envelope had to be carefully spread on the ground, inspected for tears or weak seams, then connected to hydrogen supply lines. Inflation was a delicate process. Too fast, and the envelope could tear. Too slow, and weather conditions might change. The hydrogen, produced at chemical plants operated by Showa Denko, was a scarce resource that could not be wasted. Once inflated, the balloon had to be tethered. While the chandelier was attached, the bombs loaded, the ballast bags positioned, and the control mechanism activated. Wind conditions had to be precisely correct. If the surface winds were too strong, the balloon could be damaged before launch. If they were too weak, the balloon might not rise quickly enough to catch the jet stream. Launch windows were narrow and unpredictable. Between November and March, meteorologists calculated there would be only 50 days with favorable conditions. On good days, each site could launch perhaps 60 to 70 balloons. The first Fugo balloon lifted off from Japanese shores on November 3, 1944. The date was chosen deliberately. It was the birthday of the Emperor Meiji, the ruler who had transformed Japan from a feudal society into an industrial power. The symbolism was intentional. These balloons represented Japan's continued technological prowess and fighting spirit in the face of overwhelming enemy resources. Witnesses to the launches reported a surreal sight. In the late afternoon light, dozens of massive white spheres would rise silently into the sky, climbing steadily until they became small dots, disappearing into the high clouds. Some local residents, sworn to secrecy but unable to contain their curiosity, watched from a distance. They had no idea where these strange balloons were going or what they carried. The schoolgirls who had labored for months to build them would not learn the truth for decades. Within 24 hours of the first launches, one of the balloons was spotted by an American naval patrol ship. On November 4, 1944, sailors aboard a patrol craft 66 miles southwest of San Pedro, California, saw an unusual object floating on the ocean surface. When they hauled it aboard, they found a deflated paper balloon, approximately 33 feet in diameter, with Japanese characters printed on several panels and a rising sun symbol painted on the envelope. There were no bombs attached. This was one of the experimental balloons, launched earlier for testing, and not equipped with explosives. The Navy immediately recognized this was something significant, but initially struggled to understand exactly what it was. The construction seemed impossibly fragile to have crossed any significant distance. Naval intelligence officers theorized it might have been launched from a submarine operating close to the American coast. The idea that this paper contraption had floated 5,000 miles across the open Pacific seemed absurd. But 2 weeks later, another balloon was found. This one came down near Kalispell, Montana, on December 11, 1944. It was intact, with the complete chandelier mechanism and one unexploded bomb still attached. The balloon bore production tags with Japanese writing indicating it had been completed on October 31st at a factory in Japan. This balloon had undeniably traveled across the Pacific Ocean. By the end of December, more balloons were being discovered. One fell near Thermopolis, Wyoming, on December 6th, creating a small crater when its bomb detonated. Another came down near Estacada, Oregon, on New Year's Eve. Fragments were recovered in Alaska, Washington, Montana, and California. The pattern was becoming clear. These were not submarine-launched weapons. They were true intercontinental systems, and they were arriving in increasing numbers. American military and scientific officials faced a bizarre and unprecedented situation. A handful of newspapers in Montana and Wyoming had published brief stories about the mysterious balloon findings. On December 14, 1944, the Western News in Libby, Montana, ran a story about the Kalispell balloon. Time and Newsweek magazines picked up the story for their January 1, 1945, editions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Oregonian in Portland ran a front-page article on January 2nd. These early reports were speculative, puzzled by the balloon's purpose and origin. Some writers theorized they were launched from submarines with a range of 400 miles. Others suggested they might be weather balloons that had somehow drifted astray. But military intelligence now understood the truth. These were weapons, and they were coming from Japan. The War Department and Navy faced a critical decision. Should they warn the American public about this new threat, or should they maintain absolute silence? The decision to impose silence was made quickly and with little debate. On January 4, 1945, just 2 days after the Oregonian's front-page story, intelligence officers from the Western Defense Command phoned the 3 major wire services and 6 other primary news outlets. The message was direct. All reporting on balloon incidents must cease immediately until further notice. The request was not legally binding. America had no official Secrets Act like Britain's wartime censorship laws, but the Office of Censorship, led by Byron Price, operated on a system of voluntary compliance. Newspaper editors and radio broadcasters were asked to follow a code that balanced public information with national security. The reasoning behind the blackout was straightforward. If Japan learned that their balloons were successfully reaching North America, they might increase production, refine their targeting, or worst of all, equip the balloons with chemical or biological weapons. American intelligence had tested several recovered balloons and found them free of such agents, but there was no guarantee future balloons would remain conventional. Silence would deny Japan confirmation of success. Without evidence that the Fugo campaign was working, Japanese military planners might abandon the program as ineffective. There was also the question of public morale. Military officials worried that news of bombs randomly falling from the sky would create widespread panic, particularly in the western states. The balloons were completely unguided. They could land anywhere, in cities, on farms, in forests, near schools. There was no way to predict where the next one would fall or when. The psychological impact of such randomness could be devastating. Better, officials reasoned, to keep the entire operation classified. The voluntary censorship proved remarkably effective. From coast to coast, newspapers and radio stations complied with the request. Stories that had already been written were pulled. Follow-up investigations were quietly abandoned. When new balloons were discovered, local authorities were instructed to secure the sites without publicity. The American press, operating in a culture of wartime cooperation, maintained near total silence on the subject. In Japan, the silence had exactly the intended effect. The Imperial Army had established a monitoring system, listening to American radio broadcasts and reviewing whatever news reports they could obtain through neutral countries. They heard nothing about the balloons. No panic, no emergency measures, no reports of forest fires or casualties. By February 1945, Japanese propaganda broadcasts began making wild claims about the Fugo campaign's success, claiming 500 to 10,000 casualties and massive fires across the American West. But these claims were fabrications, attempts to boost domestic morale. Japanese military planners had no actual evidence their balloons were reaching America, let alone causing damage. The lack of confirmation troubled them. Resources were scarce. Each balloon required hydrogen from chemical plants that were increasingly targeted by American bombers. The kozo trees needed for paper production were being depleted. The schoolgirls working in the factories were needed elsewhere in Japan's total war economy. Without proof the campaign was working, continuing seemed wasteful. In America, meanwhile, the balloons kept arriving. By March 1945, military and civilian authorities had recovered or observed over 100 incidents. The distribution was widespread. Most fell in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. But balloons were also found in Alaska, California, Nevada, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and as far east as Michigan. One balloon landed near Yerington, Nevada. Another came down in the Santa Clara River bed near Saticoy, California, creating a small crater. On March 10th, a balloon struck power lines at the Hanford site in Washington state, temporarily cutting electricity to the top-secret plutonium production facility that was manufacturing material for atomic bombs. The military response was substantial but quiet. Operation Sunset coordinated radar surveillance and fighter aircraft patrols along the West Coast. Over 2,000 military personnel participated in tracking, recovering, and studying the balloon bombs. Fighter pilots were scrambled to intercept balloons spotted in flight. Gun camera footage captured some of these encounters. American P-38 Lightning and P-63 King Cobra fighters pursued the balloons, which proved surprisingly difficult targets. Flying at 30,000 feet at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour when caught in strong winds, the balloons were fast and elusive. Fewer than 20 were successfully shot down by aircraft. The Western Defense Command stationed additional troops at critical points for firefighting. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the first African-American parachute unit, nicknamed the Triple Nickels, was deployed to Oregon and California for Operation Firefly. These smoke jumpers made over 1,200 jumps to fight 36 forest fires during the spring and summer of 1945, though none of these fires were definitively attributed to balloon bombs. The wet conditions of late winter and early spring prevented the large-scale forest fires Japan had hoped to ignite. Scientists worked frantically to understand the balloon's origin and capabilities. Forensic analysis of recovered balloons provided crucial intelligence. The sand used in the ballast bags contained microscopic marine organisms that could be traced to specific beaches in Japan. Geologists identified the sand as coming from beaches in the south of Honshu, near the launch sites. This intelligence allowed American planners to target B-29 raids against the hydrogen production facilities supporting the Fugo program. On April 20, 1945, Japan launched its final balloon. By then, the Showa Denko chemical plant had been heavily damaged by bombing. Hydrogen supplies were exhausted, the kozo tree forests had been depleted, and most importantly, without any evidence of success, Japanese military leadership decided the resources could be better used elsewhere. The censorship held. The American public remained largely unaware. Those who lived in areas where balloons had been found often knew through word of mouth, but they were discouraged from discussing it openly. In Yakima, Washington, a boy found what he thought was an interesting metal object and carried it around for several days before someone recognized it as a Japanese anti-personnel bomb and called authorities. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tragedy that would break the silence was unfolding in a small logging community in south-central Oregon. Bly, population 450, sat near the eastern edge of Klamath County, surrounded by the Fremont National Forest. It was logging country, isolated and quiet. In March 1945, the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church in Bly welcomed a new pastor and his wife. Reverend Archie Mitchell was 27 years old, recently graduated from seminary. His wife Elsie was 26, a Port Angeles native whose father worked at a sawmill. They were young, energetic, and deeply committed to missionary work. The Bly Church was meant to be their 2-year home service assignment before they departed for overseas missions. Elsie was 5 months pregnant with their first child. The young couple had embraced their new community, teaching Sunday school and organizing activities for the local children. On Saturday morning, May 5, 1945, Archie and Elsie decided to take 5 of their Sunday school students on a fishing trip and picnic to Gearhart Mountain. The children were Sherman Shoemaker, 11 years old, Edward Engen and J. Gifford, both 13, and Joan and Dick Patzke, sister and brother, 13 and 14. It was a beautiful spring day. The war in Europe had ended 3 days before with Germany's unconditional surrender. The Pacific War dragged on, but victory seemed inevitable. For a few hours, in the quiet Oregon forest, the war felt distant and abstract. The group drove up the winding forest road toward Leonard Creek. When the road became impassable, Archie Mitchell parked the sedan. Elsie and the children got out first, glad to stretch their legs and breathe the pine-scented air. They walked ahead, looking for a good spot near the creek. Archie Mitchell stayed behind, gathering the lunch baskets and fishing equipment from the car. He heard the children's excited voices, then Elsie calling back to him. "Look what we found, dear. It looks like some kind of balloon." Archie glanced up. 50 yards away, his wife and the 5 children stood in a circle, looking down at something on the forest floor. His mind raced. He had heard something, rumors about strange balloons. He wasn't sure of the details, but instinct told him this was dangerous. "Don't touch it," he shouted. The words were still forming when the explosion erupted. The blast was enormous, far larger than the crude bomb's size should have produced. The 33-pound anti-personnel device detonated with devastating force, sending shrapnel in all directions at lethal velocity. The explosion excavated a crater 12 inches deep and 3 feet wide. Metal fragments tore through tree trunks hundreds of feet away, burying themselves in bark and wood. Archie Mitchell ran toward the smoke and fire. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. The 5 children were dead, killed instantly by the blast. Elsie was severely wounded, her clothing on fire. Archie tried desperately to extinguish the flames, burning his hands in the attempt. She died moments later in his arms, taking with her their unborn child. 6 people dead in an instant, victims of a weapon launched nearly 2 months before from a beach 5,000 miles away. The immediate aftermath was chaos contained by military protocol. Local authorities arrived first, followed quickly by an ordnance expert from Lakeview Naval Air Station, who carefully removed the remaining unexploded incendiary bombs still attached to the balloon's chandelier. Lieutenant Colonel Charles F. Bizanius, an intelligence officer from Fort Lewis in Washington, secured the site and issued strict instructions. Newspaper accounts were to identify the blast as an explosion of unknown origin. Nothing more. The Klamath Falls Herald and News ran a front-page story on May 7, 1945. The headline read, "Blast kills 6, 5 children, pastor's wife in explosion." The article provided almost no details, stating only that the victims died from an explosion of unannounced cause. The censorship held, even as 450 people attended the mass funeral for 4 of the children in Klamath Falls on May 9th. Sherman Shoemaker's body was sent to Live Oak, California, for burial in a family plot. Elsie Mitchell was laid to rest in Port Angeles, where a monument would later be erected in Ocean View Cemetery. But the censorship system was cracking under the weight of the tragedy. The Klamath Falls Herald and News editorial board wired the Office of Censorship the day after the explosion, requesting that restrictions be lifted so the public could be informed of the danger. Archie Mitchell told reporters he had heard vague rumors about Japanese balloons and had tried to warn his wife and the children, but the Gifford family said they had no knowledge of any such weapons. How many other Americans were similarly unaware? How many other families might encounter these devices without knowing the risk? Byron Price, head of the Office of Censorship, found himself caught between military demands for continued silence and the press's increasingly urgent argument that public safety required disclosure. He approached Major General Clayton Bissell, Director of Army Intelligence, and Admiral R.S. Edwards, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, trying to persuade them to issue an official acknowledgement of the balloon attacks. The Army was willing to consider it. Edwards adamantly refused, insisting that publicity would kill Americans. The deadlock persisted for 2 weeks. Then, on May 22, 1945, the military finally relented. A carefully worded statement was released to the press, confirming that Japanese balloon bombs had been landing in North America since the previous November, warning the public not to touch any suspicious devices, and urging anyone who found a balloon to report it immediately to authorities. The statement came 17 days too late for Elsie Mitchell and the 5 children. On June 1st, the full censorship blackout was lifted. Newspapers across the country published extensive accounts of the balloon bomb campaign. The details that emerged painted a picture of a weapon both ingenious and desperate. Approximately 9,300 balloons had been launched between November 1944 and April 1945. Only about 300 to 361 were found or observed in North America, roughly 3 to 4%. The vast majority fell harmlessly into the Pacific Ocean or landed in remote wilderness areas where they were never discovered. The military provided statistics that revealed the campaign's ultimate failure. No significant forest fires were attributed to the balloon bombs, despite that being their primary intended purpose. The wet winter and early spring conditions in the Pacific Northwest had prevented the incendiary devices from starting major blazes. The one fire that did threaten serious damage was at Hanford, but backup power systems had prevented a nuclear incident. The total American casualties from 6 months of sustained balloon bombardment were 7 people: Elsie Mitchell, her unborn child, and 5 children, all killed in a single incident. Japanese propaganda broadcasts had claimed 10,000 casualties and widespread devastation. The reality was that the Fugo campaign had achieved virtually nothing of military significance, yet the theoretical danger had been real. If the balloons had been equipped with biological weapons, if they had arrived during the dry summer months when forest fires spread easily, if more civilians had encountered them without knowledge of the danger, the outcome could have been far worse. In Japan, the end of the Fugo program had come not from enemy action, but from resource exhaustion and lack of feedback. Without evidence their balloons were reaching America, Japanese planners concluded the campaign was failing. The last balloon launched on April 20th, 1945. By then, American B-29 raids had destroyed 2 of the 3 hydrogen production facilities. The Kozo forests were depleted. The schoolgirls who had spent months manufacturing the balloons were reassigned to other war work. Major General Kusaba had been planning a summer offensive with larger balloons capable of carrying heavier payloads, but the project never materialized. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. That morning, the Noborito Research Institute received orders to destroy all evidence of the Fugo program. Documents were burned, prototypes were dismantled, and ashes were buried. The schoolgirls who had built the balloons dispersed to their homes, still forbidden from speaking about their work. Many would carry that silence for decades, never telling their families what they had done during the war. Only years later, when photographs of the balloons began appearing in books and museums, did some of them realize what their labor had created. The full scope of the Fugo campaign only became clear after the war, when American military intelligence teams arrived in Japan to interview the program's designers and examine what little documentation had survived. Nearly all information about the Fugo objectives came from a single interview with Lieutenant Colonel Terato Kunitake of the Army General Staff and a Major Inoue. They confirmed that the balloon program had been terminated due to resource shortages, not enemy countermeasures. They revealed that even if the war had continued another year, the balloons would not have been used again because there was simply no way to produce them in sufficient quantities. Archie Mitchell's life continued, marked indelibly by May 5, 1945. He remarried in June 1947 to Betty Patzke, the older sister of 2 of the children killed in the explosion. They served as missionaries in Vietnam, where Archie Mitchell disappeared in 1969, likely killed by Viet Cong forces. His fate was never conclusively determined. The site where the explosion occurred became a memorial. In 1950, the Weyerhaeuser Timber Company, which owned the land, constructed a monument of native stone with a bronze plaque listing the victims' names. The plaque reads, "Who died here, May 5, 1945, by Japanese bomb explosion. Only place on the American continent where death resulted from enemy action during World War II." The monument was transferred to the Fremont-Winema National Forest in 1998 and listed on the National Times.com Register of Historic Places in 2003. A ponderosa pine near the site still bears scars from the bomb's shrapnel, a living witness to that day. In the decades after the war, a remarkable reconciliation emerged. In 1976, Sakyo Adachi, a Japanese meteorologist who had helped plan the balloon offensive, visited the Mitchell Monument site and laid a wreath. He later sent a letter of apology to the Patzke family. In 1987, a group of Japanese women who had worked as schoolgirls manufacturing the balloons delivered 1,000 paper cranes to the victims' families, a traditional Japanese symbol of peace and healing. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the tragedy, 6 cherry trees were planted at the monument site by Japanese visitors seeking to honor the dead. 2 of those trees still stand today, their blossoms each spring a quiet reminder that reconciliation is possible even after the deepest wounds. The Fugo balloon bombs represented multiple historical firsts. They were the first weapon system with true intercontinental range, predating the intercontinental ballistic missile by more than a decade. They were arguably the world's first example of automated drone warfare, pilotless weapons launched toward distant targets. They demonstrated that even a nation lacking strategic bombers could still strike an enemy homeland through technological ingenuity. And they revealed the power of information denial, how censorship and silence could render a weapons campaign ineffective by denying the attacker any knowledge of success. Balloon bombs continued to be discovered for decades after the war. In 1955, a balloon with its payload still intact was found in Alaska, 10 years after it had landed. In 1978, construction workers in Oregon uncovered balloon fragments. As recently as 2014, a balloon was discovered in British Columbia, Canada, its mechanism still technically functional after nearly 70 years. The U.S. Forest Service and Canadian authorities continue to warn hikers and outdoors enthusiasts that unexploded balloon bombs may still exist in remote wilderness areas, and that any such devices remain dangerous and should be reported immediately to authorities. The story of Operation Fugo endures as a reminder of the desperation that characterized the final year of World War II. By late 1944, Japan's military situation was hopeless. The balloon bombs were not a realistic path to victory. They were an act of defiance, a demonstration that Japan could still strike back, that the homeland could still reach across an ocean to touch American soil. They succeeded in doing exactly that, but the cost in Japanese resources and the negligible military impact made them a strategic failure. Yet, 6 Americans died because of these paper balloons. They died in a forest on a spring day, victims of a war that seemed distant but reached across the Pacific on the wind. They died because silence, meant to protect, also prevented knowledge that might have saved them. They died because war's reach extends beyond battlefields and bombers, beyond soldiers and sailors, to touch even children on a picnic in the Oregon woods. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Mitchell Monument stands today in the Fremont-Wenema National Forest, 13 miles northeast of Bly, Oregon. It remains the only place on the continental United States where American civilians were killed by direct enemy action during World War II. Visitors come to see the stone memorial, to read the names of the dead, to touch the scarred pine tree, and to reflect on a strange and tragic chapter of history. The cherry trees planted by Japanese visitors bloom each spring, their white petals falling like paper on the ground, a living apology and a promise that even enemies can become friends, that even the deepest wounds can, with time and effort, begin to heal.